pleasure to have you taking part in Hydrogen in 3. Just for the sake of the video, I know many people are aware of who you are and what you do, but could you just give us a brief overview of yourself and the business that you represent?
Sure. Great to be here, George. It's a great pleasure to spend some time with you speaking about hydrogen and just how excited we at Hyzon are about hydrogen, the potential for hydrogen, in fact, the need for hydrogen. So Hyzon's a relatively new company, having only been set up in early 2020. However, this was done on the back of almost 20 years of commercial and technical development around PEM fuel cells, with the parent company being called Horizon Fuel Cell, Singapore headquartered company with major operations in China. And going back several years, Horizon Fuel Cell had quite some success putting high-powered fuel cells into commercial vehicles as part of the Chinese drive to urban air pollution abatement, where heavy, high daily use type vehicles were encouraged to transition from diesel to hydrogen. And with that success in China, Hyzon Motors is really the embodiment of the international business development effort to take that technology that had been developed since 2003 and apply it to global markets. And what we're really about now is that Hyzon Motors is here to really accelerate the rate at which governments and corporations can decarbonize heavy vehicles.
Perfect. Well, that rolls into the first question. In terms of the sector, there's obviously that you guys have been in the sector for 20 plus years, but I'd say over the last 12 to 24 months, there's been a big push towards hydrogen. There's been quite a lot of hype regarding the sector. What role do you see in hydrogen enabling our net zero targets?
So as you're aware, George, transport accounts for a pretty fair chunk of global carbon-based emissions, around 30-odd%, depending where and when you measure it. And within the transport sector, heavy vehicles don't represent a large proportion numerically of the vehicles on the road, but they represent a very significant portion of the emissions, including an outsized representation of the harmful PM 2.5 and NOx and SOx emissions. But somewhere in the 25 to 30% of all transport emissions are coming typically from heavier vehicles. So these vehicles are often used many, many hours of every day. And it's these types of duty cycles with high combined vehicle mass type operations that really make hydrogen an essential part of decarbonizing those heavy vehicle activities. You need to be able to carry a lot of payload. You need to be able to drive, long distances. You need to be able to use the vehicle 16, 18, 20, 24 hours a day sometimes. Yeah. And with these types of requirements, it's really only hydrogen that's able to replicate the behavior of a diesel vehicle, if you like, or the operating characteristics of a diesel vehicle. And that's because when you try to electrify vehicles, if you are only using batteries, then you need to keep adding battery for range, even though you don't need the extra power that the additional batteries are giving you. Whereas with a fuel cell, once you configure and specify the power needed from the fuel cell itself and the electric motor, then to add range, you simply add more hydrogen. And that's exactly the same as the way a diesel vehicle works. Yeah. The engine is specified based on, how heavy the vehicle is and how fast it needs to drive, etc. And the range is determined only by the size of the diesel tank. So it's that similar vehicle architecture separating the power characteristics from the driving range characteristics. It's that architecture that enables fuel cell vehicles to replicate diesel vehicle activities.
Perfect. And that rolls into the next question that I do have. Obviously, there's the hype there, but we are seeing a lot of investments, MOUs, but the positive aspects are there, and we are working towards the targets that we have. But what challenges do you feel we face as a sector, not just in Europe, US, but globally?
Clearly, if you're going to consider changing out a fuel for a lot of vehicles that are operating in different parts of the world, a big rate determining step of any such transition is going to be the availability of that fuel.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of talk about the challenges to get to the economics needed on hydrogen, but actually we believe once the scale of projects that are bringing hydrogen to market, once the scale has increased along the lines of a lot of announcements that have been made, and once there's more and more localized production close to demand centers for vehicles, for example, we believe the economics will take care of itself. We're not afraid of the economics of hydrogen driving the energy transition. We believe zero emission trucks can operate at and below diesel cost parity in the near future, and we're very actively pursuing some projects that will prove that, demonstrate that. But it's the availability, it's how quickly it can come to market, and whether you can bring it to market in the places where it's most advantageous to deploy vehicles, for example. So with hydrogen infrastructure being the major rate determining step at which customers, governments and corporations can adopt fuel cell heavy vehicles, it's incumbent on Hyzon to play a part in fostering and facilitating the hydrogen supply side. So we're very actively involved with technology partners, project developers and investors on setting up hydrogen production, which will be located close to the demand centers for the molecules as fuel. So we work with fleet customers to ascertain their possible uptake on our vehicles, our heavy vehicles, which that translates then to very predictable demand, because all these vehicles are commercial vehicles with very predictable, usage cycles. So this, by having this very predictable demand on the hydrogen fuel, we're able to provide really good certainty to investors and project developers on hydrogen, so they can make hydrogen available in the right locations. And by going after back to base vehicles, which operate a lot of hours every day, we can create really nice demand centers so that you can create hydrogen ecosystems around a hydrogen production and a hydrogen offtake model in the form of the heavy vehicles. So we're very actively involved in some projects in California, in Australia, and looking at some in Europe as well, where Hyzon is really joining the dots around the demand for the molecules and the supply for those hydrogen molecules. And we do believe that this focus on high daily usage back to base vehicles provides the best starting point for hydrogen, because you can get a lot of utility out of a single asset that's making and dispensing hydrogen for a fleet in a given area. And once that hydrogen is available in a certain area, it will make other vehicle opportunities, other vehicle applications nearby, it will make them highly viable because the molecules are already there. You don't need to make some big CapEx investment to make the hydrogen available. And we do believe that there's a huge advantage on hydrogen as you try to electrify these heavy vehicles, because of the fact that a single piece of hydrogen infrastructure can fuel 50, 80, 100 vehicles a day, no problem. Whereas if you try to electrify without using hydrogen as the energy carrier, you really do run into some limitations to scale. The charging and also the power supply itself can be really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And that rolls into the final question I do have, more focused on Hyzon and essentially how Hyzon will help develop the value chain throughout 2022 and beyond, really.
Sure. So Hyzon is very focused on bringing to market our higher power density fuel cells, which are designed to power trucks. So if you look at the evolution of PEM fuel cell technology, you see that a lot of the fuel cells have been designed from one of two directions. Either historically they were designed for stationary power applications, or historically they were designed for passenger car applications. And all of these various developers of fuel cells are now trying to apply all those fuel cell technologies and capabilities to heavy vehicles, because the world is increasingly lining up behind the consensus that the decarbonisation of heavier vehicles really does need hydrogen. And so you've got these various, fuel cell technologies around the world that are now being applied to trucks. Well, we like to point out that in the last 7, 8, 9 years, our focus on our high-powered fuel cells from day one was trucks. So as we developed our high-powered fuel cells, every decision we made around the design of the fuel cells, the materials we used, how the system worked and integrated and was controlled was all about trucks. So this gives us quite a unique position. And I will add that I'm sitting here in Chicago area right now in Bolingbrook in our innovation center. We just recently started building our first complete fuel cell stacks and systems here in the US for the global Hyzon assembly operations. And this is really a watershed moment for Hyzon, because becoming completely independent on the supply of those fuel cells and not being dependent on our parent company's supply, which we've done in the early stages. We've purchased fuel cells from Horizon to put into trucks in the US and Europe, for example. We will be completely independent on that, fully vertically integrated, doing our own MEA manufacturing, our own fuel cell stack and system assembly. And that really gives us a very strong position to drive the adoption. So we're very involved in making fuel cells viable as a commercial proposition, as an operating proposition, in terms of performance of the vehicles. And then finally, in terms of total cost of ownership, which includes fuel. Yeah. So we're very involved in encouraging those hydrogen ecosystems to build up in areas where there's a lot of heavy vehicle activity. That could be, seaports, airports, intermodal logistics areas, areas that are dense with local, especially fresh food type distribution, garbage collection, some of these different truck activities where you see a lot of activity in a given area. Yeah. We're really encouraging and facilitating, like I said earlier, the production of hydrogen to meet the needs of those vehicles in those local deployment type scenarios, or as we like to call them, hydrogen ecosystems.
Yeah. No, definitely. And from our perspective as well, we do feel the same way. The mobility sector is commercialized very quickly and does seem the access to market is there. So I think it's very much people working together. I know you guys at Hyzon, you have various different partnerships, don't you, that enable the sector. So no, I definitely agree with you on that. And as said at the start, it's a pleasure to have you take part and get your insight and have you part of the platform. And we wish you all the best for 2022 as well.
Thank you, George. And hydrogen is here. Hydrogen is now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Craig.